very much for this wonderful welcome, a beautiful venue, I have to say. You're very lucky as a member to be coming to this venue, and I just should do the same if invited again. So I'm going to talk about a difficult subject today. It is Israel's longest war, and I will try, amidst all difficulty, to envision the day after. So Joe told me to leave with some hopeful note, so that's not the easiest thing to do, but this is a mission that I'm going to undertake. So you have to know that a year ago, I was also in the Middle East, in Israel in particular. So it was August of 2023. And while there, I wrote a piece that came out in the Newsline magazine, and it was entitled, Israel's Golem and the Crisis of Democracy. Now, it was a very different topic at the time, in August 2023. And there I argued that the Netanyahu's government had created its own golem, which is its own monster, an ultra-right-wing government that was planting the seeds of its own destruction. In August of 2023, you may recall that there were about the Israeli protest movement that was already in its 9th month, organizing to counter the government's overall of the country's judicial process. In that same piece, I really expressed some concern about the tension that exists between secular and religion and religious people within Israel, which had the potential to drive the country toward some form of illiberalism. I also noted that Israeli protesters had missed the opportunity to create domestic political alliance with Arab parties and to see common ground with Palestinians living in the post-1967 borders. Sadly, this article, which was soon picked up by the Jordan News, became sort of a dark prophecy. It was published on October 3rd, and it was sort of a dark prophecy about an imminent catastrophe that since unfolded in the war that began on October 7. So, so today, despite the despair in both Israel and Gaza, we know that people are yearning for peace, but most have no understanding of how to get there. That is really what I have registered talking to a great number of people. So what I will do today is I will walk you through several possible options before proposing a viable confederal alternative, drawing on the lessons of failed peace processes in the past and highlighting possibilities for regional stability and cooperation. Don't ask me how I do that, but I'm going to do that. This is now Israel's longest war. As I just mentioned before, it's in its 11th month since it began on October 7. So no other war were as long as this one. So we had, even 1948 was a long war that lasted 9 months. The 6 Days War, 6 days. The Yom Kippur's War, 18 days. Even the Lebanon War was 3 years, but really the intensity of the war was only 3 months. But this one really is the longest war that Israel had experienced, certainly since independence in 1948. And Israel never fought such a long war, it is really not well equipped for one, because it depends on reservists who form the majority of the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. And so while one could say that the current war has more significantly affected Palestinians in Gaza, it has also affected Israel deeply, weakening its economy, disrupting life, and traumatizing conscripted soldiers and reservists now fighting on multiple fronts. So almost a year after I wrote that article on Israel's crisis of democracy, I returned to Israel. And this time, if you think that my last year's visit was a tough visit, this one a much, much worse, a difficult visit. It was difficult because for people from all walks of life were in despair, they were exhausted, they were pessimistic about the future. But then on July 1st of 2024, just just a month and a half ago, at the great arena of Tel Aviv. 6,000 people gathered for a major event, which was called It's Time, just translated in two languages here, to give peace a chance. That really surprised me. I really did not expect that was possible. They were all peace activists, both Israelis and Palestinians, and young people rallying for perhaps their first time. And to me, having been through periods of peace processes and more euphoric around them, it felt like back to the future moment, with booths of pro-peace NGOs selling pamphlets and T-shirts around the event. So it was almost something very surreal, if you want. It was reminiscent to me of a bygone heyday of the Israeli Peace Now movement during the 1980s and the 1990s. A day later, I was in a different place, a very desolate hangar, military hangar in south of Tel Aviv. The site was purposefully chosen by very talented choreographers who danced breathlessly about a very different topic, the war within. It was sort of about PTSD in a way. A subsequent performance a few days later by the dance group, an Israeli dance group called Batsheva, including lamenting women pretending to be pregnant by hiding under their dress a watermelon. They were pretending to be pregnant. Only to see the next scenes of the dance where they start shattering with rage on the stage the fruits, the baby, allegedly, and then pick them up and just lull them with tenderness. This shows was masterfully captured the agony of victims suffering from trauma and the distress of all women in wartime. The Peace Summit and the dance performance may have evoked opposite emotion, but at the same time, they were united by the same one. Traumatized people yearn for peace, but most of them do not know how to get there. And so that is sort of what I started reflecting upon during the moment after those two performances, the Summit for Peace and thereafter those two superb choreography. As the war dragged on, the post-October 7 mood has descended into a visceral, morbid agony throughout Israeli civil society. And I have not had the possibility, of course, to visit this time Gaza, certainly not the West Bank, so I'm going to just focus a little bit more on that, but also highlight the other aspect of the war. The streets of Tel Aviv have lost their youthful vibrancy, and I don't know if any of you have ever been in that part of the world. This is a town that is really very youthful, very vibrant. There were still some bubbly enclaves of the old Yemeni, Ethiopian, Bohemian neighborhoods at the edge of the central city, but even there, no one was really deceived by the mimicry of normalcy. It was a very, very sad place to be. In one sense, one could say that despite entrenched domestic divisions within Israel, the country had come back together to face an existential threat after the attack that left more than 1,200 innocent people dead in one day on October 7. Yet at the same time, most Israelis ask, how can we trust this government that has been completely delegitimized? First, by the failure to prevent the attack, which really led to a real intelligence fiasco, then by its perpetuation of a never-endless disaster. If one were to reduce or to capture all the emotion that I was able to hear in the streets of Israel, was we are so lost. And that is really what captures the language of many people there. After Israel killed both Hamas political leaders, Ismail Haniyeh, and Hezbollah top military Fuad Shukr, an Israeli newspaper cartoon showed people that were looking in distress toward the sky, waiting for a potential retaliation. They're still looking up, wondering when that's coming. But 3 weeks later, Israeli preempted a major Hezbollah revenge attack by destroying rocket and launchers on the ground. And only yesterday and today, as you know, Israeli planted explosive in pagers and walkie-talkies. So Israel has and is and remain still at the center of a prospective regional war. It's not a done deal. So the question that I've been asking is what comes next. In Gaza, let's think about Gaza. The whole world has seen the scenes of horror. Hamas had been severely crippled by its fighter reappear in area where civilians seek refuge from Israeli strikes. And now the murder of 6 hostages on August 31st makes peace even, a further reality. 40,000 people have been killed in Gaza. The majority of them are civilians, and since October 7. And growing social chaos has heightened the humanitarian crisis, where, with nowhere to exit, Palestinians are in despair, but Israeli military operations continuing. Alongside ceasefire talks, repeatedly issuing new evacuation orders, which together with ongoing violence further exacerbate the humanitarian disasters and the humanitarian calamity that has been ongoing. Approximately 86% of Gaza is now under evacuation order, leading to massive displacement with over 2 million people crammed into increasingly unsafe and unsanitary conditions. Despite this, we know that many United Nations organizations and NGOs organizations are still attempting to provide critical healthcare services, but that has not been very easy. As of now, Israeli officials insist that military operation will continue until the end of this year. The goal is to neutralize Hamas. Meanwhile, even in a slow-down war, which is what a lot of Israeli military talk, the consequences for Palestinians are significant, and the future for Israeli remains dark. Did I tell you I was going to talk to you about the day after? Okay, promises kept. All right, now that I made you extremely dark, sad and in despair, I'm going to try to flip this and see if we can move forward into a different direction. Could you just move this screen? It's not conducive to talking about the possibility. But short of a path to peace, the current options are really daunting. There are some plans, they're not real plans, scenarios that could be envisioned. One of them, which is not a great one, but nonetheless one, is that there is a possibility of indefinitely postponing a long-term solution. That is always a scenario. That would mean that the war grinds in a slower motion, with continued Israeli blows toward neutralizing Hamas, and this would eliminate the option of freeing the hostages, leaving them to languish underground, to be killed, protecting Hamas military leadership. Humanitarian efforts will further fall behind as more infrastructure is damaged or destroyed, setting the stage for eventually re-empower militant where they call themselves Hamas or something else. In this scenario, the ultra-right-wing religious zealot people like, and maybe you know those names, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, would take advantage of the Palestinian political vacuum to call for the returns of settlers who, since their forced withdrawal of Gaza in 2005, because they did leave in 2005, have yearned to come back, creating a greater Israel that gradually replaced the Palestinian population. The West Bank would continue to be explosive, with escalating violence between Israeli settlers and Palestinians. Violence would also continue between Israel's and Iran's regional proxies, and perhaps Iran itself, running the risk of a catastrophic full-scale war which neither side want. Now, you have to know that unlike the ultra-right-wing religious zealots, there are the Israelis who serve in the army. And those Israelis do not want to be an occupying force. Those Israelis are really tired to be continuing in this longest possible war. Many, however, believe that the scenario is favored by their government ruling coalition. Now, there's another option, since we're going to talk about different scenarios. And it's called, I don't particularly like the term, but it's been used, it's called the mow the lawn scenario. It's a really unpleasant, if not repugnant, metaphor, but I still will talk about that because it is one that really refers not really about conflict resolution, but more about conflict management, in which Israel pulls out, but continues to intervene intermittently for the foreseeable future. In this logic, whenever the weeds, mow the lawn, whenever the weeds reach an intolerable point, Israel ruthlessly retaliates, gaining periods of respite after mowing the lawn again. So it's not really a solution, it's not really a conflict resolution, it's a conflict management. After October 7, the status quo ante scenario is no longer tenable. Israel cannot simply leave Gaza, risking a future Hamas attack on the scale of October 7 or worse. At the same time, occupying fully or partially Gaza indefinitely precludes the stability that is needed for its reconstruction. Now, you have to understand that no potential donors among the Arab states are willing to rebuild the Gaza Strip while the threat of violence persists. In other words, if mowing the lawn was a tragic and destabilizing scenario in the past, it's even more so impossible today. It's not viable today. And then there is a third scenario. That's the one that you hear the most these days, right? And it's focused more narrowly on hope for an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages. A great majority of Israelis believe that ending the conflict will bring the hostage home and call indefatigably every week on Saturday, every week, throughout all the country, for the resignations of Netanyahu's government and his ultra-right sycophants. Every week. There have been hundreds of thousands of vocal protesters for the outcome of every Saturday in Tel Aviv and other cities. And they called for a general strike after the cold-blooded murders of the 6 hostages on August 31st, and that never stopped since. Yet one must wonder, if we focus on that particular scenario, one must wonder whether the hostages will ever be free so long as Hamas is still operating in the tunnel. That's a plausible question to ask. After all, the hostages presumably provide some level of protection to Hamas, leader Sinwar, and providing Hamas only sources of leverage, when you think about that. So it's a very complicated situation. From the Israeli government perspective, it is, of course, unthinkable to leave Hamas in control of Gaza, however crippled it might be, and it's the price of freeing the hostages. At the same time, protesters are seeking an immediate ceasefire, should understand that the fate of the hostage cannot be envisioned as an end in and of itself. There must be something more beyond that. It can't be just the last proposal, the last solution. So that takes me back to what the Biden administrations have been calling for a long time already, since November or December of 2023, said there should be a two-state solution. Now, okay, as you all know, this is not a new idea. In fact, this has been an old idea. As we consider a viable path forward, we need first to assess the lesson from the failed Israeli-Palestinian peace process and the two-state solution. So if we were to address that as a possibility, we need to understand what failed to begin with, right? So senior officials from the Clinton administration have argued that the Oslo process ultimately failed because Palestinian Liberation Organization leader Yasser Arafat left the negotiating table at Camp David too. That's usually the story that we hear. In 2000, perhaps because he was unhappy with the progress on the issue of Jerusalem and the refugee settlements, or perhaps because he was unwilling to reach a final deal. But whatever the reason, Palestinian disillusionment and frustration raged after the Camp David, the failed Camp David effort, and prompted the Second Intifada. Terrorist attack in Israel, in turn, produced a shift in Israeli views, as many conclude that Palestinian leaders were uninterested in the compromise needed to resolve the conflict. But as you know, as we hope, the wheels of history rolls forward. They always do, hopefully for progressive and hopeful ways, but they do. It must be acknowledged then that a renewed search for a two-state solution will encounter the same formidable hurdles that presented themselves over 2 decades ago. In fact, both the stake and the challenge today are even greater. And so how do we reconsider the obstacle that once the two-state solution champions face? To list just a few of the major issues. Israel's settlement in the West Bank was a problem then, but now it's worse. It doubled in number since 2000, seriously undermining any attempts to create a Palestinian state with contiguous borders. Champions of the position have entertained the idea that under Palestinian sovereignty, Jewish settlers would either leave the West Bank or keep residing on a new form of governance, the Palestinian state, a new Palestinian state. But let's not be fooled. This problem was then marred with problem, as it is today, and so we need to think about that. The West Bank unification and with Gaza seem equally problematic then, but even now, even more so, as the 2 main Palestinian political factions, Fatah and Hamas, have been divided both geographically and ideologically since 2006, when Hamas won in Gaza. Neither of those parties have allowed free election in the area they rule. That is an important thing to recall. And the lack of democratic control and institution with Palestinian governance make it even harder to imagine the emergence of a Palestinian leadership that Israel would trust and accept. Now, add to this, this is not usually part of the conversations about the failures of the peace agreement. Add to this the widening economic gap between Israeli and Palestinians, which suggests that the Palestinian state will be financially unstable alongside its wealthier neighbor, and the tremendous disparity that exists both on different levels in the security apparatus and the economic apparatus, in which a Palestinian state would remain dependent on its ally and its neighbors, including Israel. In this sense, the viability of a Palestinian self-determination and statehood will depend on guaranteeing basic human rights combined with the economic capacity to implement and to sustain these rights. These vital underlying preconditions for peace were unfortunately ignored in the two-state solution proposal at Oslo, and they have only worsened since. Okay. I've only tell you just bad supposed scenario. I'm going to try another one. Okay, one-state solution. The one-state solution is one that I'm going to consider very serious proposals of the one-state solution. Those who seriously have envisioned a single unified Israeli-Palestinian state call for a secular government and the primacy of individual right over group rights. In such a unitary democratic state, should it exist, individuals' ethnic and religious identities would be pushed on the sidelines. National identifications and affiliations would remain personal, but they would become irrelevant in the public spheres. All citizens would be recognized equally by the state. On the face of it, it's not a bad idea. But in that model, all the people, sorry, but I'm going to have to use that, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean would enjoy the same rights to equality, justice, and freedom. Maybe this is what Western protesters meant when they chant the slogan from the river to the sea. But it's a vision that is very far away from the one that is advocated by Hamas. Hamas has envisioned a state from the river to the sea and made it explicit that would be authoritarian, anti-human rights, with principles dictated by their own brand of Islamism. Women would have been subordinated, so if subordinate legal status will continue to have a subordinated legal status. Homosexual would be still a crime, and Jews would at best be indulged as an obedient minority within an Islamic caliphate. So here we have obstacles as well, because even in its secular and democratic interpretation, a one-state solution remains politically and emotionally unrealistic, not just for the Jews in Israel, but also from the Palestinians on the other side. Given the memories of the historical persecutions of Jews that engendered Zionism, which is a premise on the right of Jews to self-determination, few Israeli Jews would agree to become a vulnerable minority in such a unified state. But let's not be fooled. Very few Palestinians, aside from in the region, not in the West, in the region, would find this proposal appealing. The fear of Jewish domination, in which the current powerful Jewish states maintain its hegemonic control over Palestinian citizens, is very daunting for that same population. In short, years of conflicts have created deep psychological barriers and collective distrust, and October 7 and the war that followed has made the barriers even greater. So if we don't have a two-state, if we don't have a one-state, what do we have? What's left? Okay. So giving the obstacle to both the unitary and the two-state solution, it is understandable perhaps why so little has changed since the failure of the Oslo Agreement, and why those ideas, that specific idea was easily subverted or sabotaged thereafter. Both options, one state, two states, are incomplete options. Each secures only selective aspects of a broader objectives, which call for security, economy, cultural, and civil political rights for both sides. Even if one could address these obstacles, the lack of interim process made both of these options unrealistic. Indeed, I would submit that a major cause of the failure of Camp David peace process was a 7-year paralysis that followed Oslo, during which Israeli security was viewed as the sine qua non condition, and no serious proposal was then offered for social and economic opportunity for the impoverished Palestinian population. The Oslo Agreement did not compensate for the loss of financial support after a large number of Palestinian workers were evicted from Kuwait after 1991 Gulf War. Those hurdles had fomented the Second Intifada, which in turn fostered a condition for more violence, corrupt leaders, and the decline of democracy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please understand, we have currently one viable state, established state, Israel. And then there is another one that is not viable currently, right? So the situation compels us to consider either as an interim or a final option. But those interim options are not just sort of like, let's transit to them fast. We have to consider them very seriously, because the last time they were derailed and created the second intifada and created just radicalizations that lead us to the current time. So I will submit another proposal, but it's not far from the other one. It's just an attempt to address some of the problem and the obstacle that I discussed previously. And that is a confederal approach. But to establish such a confederal approach, we need to see several elements to be just in place before that work. So a couple of preliminary remarks as to how to think about this. First, it lasts for an initial period of confidence building, like my screen, just remember everything. A confederal approach would require the presence of actors drawn from the international community to help secure the development of a viable Palestinian state, which now doesn't exist. While neither side is likely to fully trust an international broker to be impartial, it is difficult to envision tangible human rights progress without a third party, whose legitimate authority is accepted by both parties to the conflict. Such an international partner, whether from states, one state or several states, would be required to allay fears and persuade the two sides that negotiation can advance the shared interest in enduring peace. And then there is another tenet that we should consider. The chosen representative of the international community would assist in the development of a unified Palestinian government drawn from a new generation of peace-oriented and democratic leaders. One can imagine a gradual transition in which the initial action of international and regional stakeholders yield to co-governance, then Palestinian control, the essential need for foreign funding of Gaza reconstruction and other developmental projects will give the provisional international authority great leverage, including ensuring that outside funding is channeled directly to Palestinian civil society for economic development, education, public health, rather than diverted to leaders bent on accumulating weapons and preparing for a renewed war. That is very important to secure that transition, right? And a third tenet for our consideration would be that this agreed upon international body would also have independent judicial authority to monitor violations of some basic rights. It would ensure civil, political, economic, security, and cultural rights for all, including the rights of women intended at all stages of the peace process. Oslo taught us, the Oslo Agreement really taught us a really important lesson, that interim processes can be easily derailed. Hence the importance of those international mechanisms that are well anchored, well entrenched, that enforce compliance with fundamental rights, while the current problems posed by extremism on both sides will remain. The emergence of a realistic path will leave them increasingly discredited and marginalized. People need hope, but they need to be presented with those hope, and that's really one of the idea behind this. And fourth, my last tenet, would be a confederal mechanism would promote both sovereign independence and bilateral cooperation of both parties in several fields, from economic development to security, in which guarantee freedom of speech and freedom of and from religion would foster progress in negotiation. So the importance of confidence-building mechanism is part of this picture. Ongoing dialogue with the ultimate form of territorial, administrative, and governing arrangement. All step forward will have to consider the wide social, economic, and civil right discrepancy that exists between the two sides and elevate them, because otherwise it just won't work. So ultimately, we all know, and this is part of the big picture, that the prospect of an Israeli-Palestinian peace is inseparable from the broader challenge of regional stability. As we know what's happening right now in Hezbollah and Iran proxy, you can't just extricate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the regional stability. So an incipient Israeli-Palestinian confederacy or arrangement of that sort would need to be integrated into the region, whose conflicts are substantially rooted in the Sunni-Shiite divides between and in place within the region's states. Here again, one we need to learn from previous historical regional peace arrangement. So let's not be so dark and gloomy and all that, because there were peace processes in the region after all, right? The Egyptians were the first to sign a peace treaty with Israel in 1917, Camp David I. The Jordanians followed suit in 1993 after the first Oslo Agreement. And then later on, we know, in September 2020, 10 years after the Arab Springs and the subsequent war of attritions with ISIS, 3 more Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, later joined by Sudan, signed the Abraham Accord, normalizing relationship with Israel. So this happened. It did. And so the question here, how to think forward. Well, one of the problems of the Abraham Accord, as we all know, is that the issue of the Palestinian question was pushed on the sideline. It was not brought in, and that really proved to be explosive. The war of October 7 proved us once again that overlooking the long-term solution for Palestinians is a fatal mistake for all parties concerned. Iran and its regional proxies, with its Hamas, Hezbollah, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen, sided with Hamas, regarding Israel and the United States as their arch enemies. And this dynamic has continued to threaten escalation to an all-out war that would likely draw the United States and would be ruinous for the whole region. So far too little attention has been paid to an underlying factor which has fostered and sustained this danger, the deep economic distress that exists in that part of the world. People are trying to think about how you create solutions, but really, every country that are part of the axis of resistance of Iran's are very poor country. And that should bring us to think about that. In Lebanon, on the news yesterday and today, unemployment and poverty has reached a severe level, including an inability to deliver critical public services. Hezbollah has largely supplanted the government in all key areas, including military powers and political control. While Hezbollah retains substantial support among the country's Shiite population, it is widely seen as illegitimate. And between 2015 and 2023, Yemen, where Iran's Houthi proxy have become dominant, has experienced a 54% decline in real GDP per capita, leaving most Yemeni in poverty, utter poverty. Food insecurity affects half of that population, and youth mortality rates have surged. Iran itself has not been spared this descent into poverty. But in February 2024, Iran's one-year inflation rates were 35%, with its middle class hurt the hardest. At the same time, widespread opposition to the regime has resulted in violent suppression. Some Iran experts now hope that this domestic pressure may prompt the country's hidden leaders to reconsider policy which risk domestic collapse and regional war. So those are the countries at war. They are poor and are not doing well domestically. And so the question is, if we're thinking about regional peace, we have to consider that particular problem, which is not a small one. while the region-leading economy, led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, benefit from a favorable environment for oil and natural gas export, they also deploy substantial resources toward the diversification of their economy, including the area of renewable energy, technology, and tourism. Yet the Muslim Middle East, I don't know if you knew that, because I always found it extraordinary, the Muslim Middle East is not just so impoverished, but intra-regional Middle Eastern trade is reduced to a very low number, 17.8% of total trade within the Middle East. This is pretty low. You have to consider, right? So you have youth unemployment stands at between 15 and 33%, the lowest income and highest unemployment in the world, given the level of education, especially when compared to, especially for women compared to their male compatriot. So those grim statistics, believe it or not, could be reversed. They could be. Simply removing non-tariff barrier to trade with other Middle Eastern countries would substantially increase regional trade, boosting infrastructural investment and increase female employment, among other objectives. A second corresponding advance in economic development could be achieved by developing a new regional transportation system, okay? I had written a book, this is my, just in case I'm plugging it, but it's The Levant Express, The Arab Spring, Human Rights, and the Future of the Middle East, which was published by Yale in 2019. And there I detailed how an economic infrastructure and infrastructure development could benefit from international and regional investment in an integrated set of policies that would lead to railroad, solar powers, and trade. It could have rebuilt the pre-1948 Hejaz Railway. I don't know if you know about the Hejaz Railway, but that was one that connected all the, see over there, all the Middle East, I mean, a great part of the Middle East together. That was during the Ottoman Empire. So you think this is a pipe dream, but that's what was there in 2000, I mean, the early 20th century. It was a Hejaz Railway. So I thought, why not rebuilding this railroad again and provide an incredible amount of unemployment for the youth and unemployment that exists in the region? That rail system alone, which could today be powered partially by the sun, would ultimately increase trade, creating a deepening regional market economy. Such development would both spur shared prosperity and forge cultural bridges across Jewish, Muslim, and Sunni and Shiite divide. This is a propitious history to there is a propitious history to such endeavor from those developed in the United States, for instance, started during the New Deal, to the building of the European Common Market and the European Union, which transcended the very disintegrative impact of 2 world wars. So while economic integration does not guarantee peace, we all know that, but it is worthy an effort worthy to consider that, because the historically vetted European post-war project remain a success story worthy of emulations in the Middle East. That is a discussion, of course, that may go well beyond the scope of my conversation today and my remarks today, but nonetheless something to think about as we talk about those days after. And so I would like to return now to my first point, and in conclusion, we should try to focus our attention on the new generation of Israeli and Palestinians advocates for peace, the one that I met at that famous Peace Congress on July 2nd, including those who they express a yearning for peace in this time gathering in Tel Aviv, where young people join progressive leaders on stage expressing eagerness to assume responsibility for the future. They, along with other Middle Eastern people, are exhausted by wars from which no one benefits. I mean, truly no one benefits. This young generation has a real rendezvous with destiny. But here I'm just going to conclude so we'll have time for questions and answers. I'd like to echo one of my favorite leaders after the World War II, and this is Eleanor Roosevelt, who says it isn't enough to talk about peace. One must believe in it. And it is not enough to believe in it. One must work at it. And I would add, one must work at it relentlessly with others. I've briefly identified plausible and possible paths forward, both for the Israeli and Palestinians and for the region as a whole. And they are worth investigation, consideration. The stakes are too high, way too high, not to embark on the alternative to that otherwise deadly current impasse. Thank you.
I have a question about your confederation idea. And my guess is that the far right in Israel and the extremists in Hamas will never agree to that proposal. And I'm wondering if you envision a full-time UN peacekeeping occupation to keep the peace, because my guess is that you're not going to be able to have a peaceful solution with the far right and the extremists without some kind of international peacekeeping. And I doubt the Israelis would ever agree to have a full-time occupation force in Israel.
A full-time occupation of
The area.
the area. I believe, and you know, that the ultra-right parties do not represent the majority of Israeli voters as we speak. In fact, if there was a new election in Israel, that government would not be put back into power. That's one thing to remember. The fatigue that I discussed about, the yearning for peace, is such that there will need to be at least some form of comfort to know that short of a two-state solution tomorrow, as the Biden administration has proposed, there needs to be some interim processes that are not just for the Israeli force to occupy the Gaza, which is not what the majority of the Israelis wish to have, but something different. And what is that different sort of mechanism? I call it confederal. Right? It could be called differently, and I just don't need copyright on that term because it's widely used. But what is important is to create those mechanisms, sort of occupation, military occupation, whether it's by a united peace force, that is more than a security arrangement. It has to focus on delivery of good, economic delivery of good. It has to also focus on the possibility for individuals to express themselves without fear of retaliation, as they are so far experiences both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. There has to be the capacity to make sure that there are no violations of some basic rights that create more stability in the future. So I would like to say that beyond a security arrangement, which is important, we need also to consider some other pillars that will sustain a security arrangement, whether it is because of a co-governance between the Palestinian Authority and another international body, call it the United Peacekeeping, not sure that it's the best one, or another concoction. Nonetheless, it needs to happen outside of Israel purview. Otherwise, it's not going to work either.
Thank
The
you. We have
alternative is not good.
a question here in the back.
Thank you. You did a great job. I don't know what's going on over there. I mean, that's the simplest statement. But anyway, let me ask you two questions. What happened to the flooding of the tunnels? One question. Israel's way back in the beginning, they said they were going to flood the tunnels, and it went away. The second one was, what has happened with the ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are the only major Israeli Jewish population that are expanding, but does not work, does not go into the military, and is on welfare? Thank you.
Thank you. So with respect to your first question, the reason why Israel did not flood the tunnel is because there are hostages in the tunnels, and they are very scared and afraid that it will hurt and cost the life of those hostages. As for the second question, which is, let me just. The ultra-Orthodox. Yes, there has been since, and I explained that in also my article last year, great tensions between the secular and ultra-Orthodox. Part of the reason is because many of them do not serve the Israeli Defense Force, and it has created situations in which the secular are asking why should be working more, paying your taxes, and at the same time serve serve when you don't. So there has been, just as of recently, an effort to recruit 6,000 of this ultra-Orthodox in a division. Not sure that it's going to be the most viable and division and unit in the IDF. But nonetheless, there is an effort to gradually bring them into the army. The army is, and possibly could be, a way of leveling those differences. It's a surprising idea, but nonetheless it makes sense, because once you know that your life is at stake, less likelihood you're going to send people to war. So of course, recruiting more of the ultra-Orthodox would be extremely important, and it's not surprising why the tension has been exacerbated between ultra-Orthodox and the secular population in Israel as a result of the October 7 war.
Questions on this side?
This one.
Good.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Netanyahu and what's going to happen to him, and is there some sort of path to his removal, since there seems to be widespread dissatisfaction with him?
What would happen, what should happen, are two different questions. What Israel is still a democracy, and it's a very airtight governmental coalition. Each of the parties of the coalition, the governmental coalitions of Netanyahu, none of them wants to leave, because they know that if they leave, there will be elections the following day, and they will not come back. So everybody's sticking with each other. It's a very strange situation. So the democratic protest movement has not been yet successful enough, despite an unprecedented tidal waves of those protests going throughout, happening throughout the country week after week. So unclear. You know, it's interesting because in the Yom Kippur War, it was just an 18 days war, the populations that were challenging the Golda Meir government succeeded. The government failed. Golda Meir was, under investigations with all its cabinet to find out how did she, the war was undertaken, and if it was, and what was the intelligence failures of October 6. It's 1973. This government is not willing to go anywhere. Personally, perhaps the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is fearing indictment if he were to step down. He's already under, judicial review. So it's very difficult to know what really would happen. But the pressure of the protests has never been so high, and the movement is really pushing the immediate ceasefire, to get that form of respite. So I wish I could forecast everything. It seemed that I forecasted October 7. I do not know how long Benjamin Netanyahu will stay in power, but suffice to note that there is only 2 more years for him, and he will have to go through new elections. So that is the one thing you can think about. Maybe it's...
No.
Netanyahu is obviously an issue in coming to any of the resolutions that you put on the screen, including the Confederacy, but Iran is too. Mm-hmm. And whereas I might think that there is a possibility of a reasonable Palestinian entity that could form and come, with the pressures that Iran will put on them, I'm not sure there is. What is it that what are the pressures that can be put on Iran? Can Saudi put any pressure on Iran with money Can the U.S. do that to bring them to the table? Because I don't see it.
Yes,
Do
no,
you?
yes, no, yes. So starting with the Saudi Arabia, you know that the Gulf countries are really the archenemy of Iran. Certainly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had their islands just crossed on the Persian Gulf, threatened by the Iranian. They will do anything, I mean anything, to reconstruct Gaza and make sure that Hamas is never under the yoke again of the Iranian. Everything. They cannot corrupt them with money. That is certainly not going to happen. What is one of the plausible paths to consider is the fact that the Iranians are under enormous economic stress. Social protest movement is still existing, not to the way it was a year or so ago, but it's still there. And there is a new president that arrived since July, and that president is sort of more considered conservative but a reformist and wants more cooperations with the West because of this economic distress. There are two ways of thinking about that. Some suggest that keep the pressure on Iran and the protest movement will succeed and Iran will, and the government will fall. That's one way of thinking. The other way of thinking is that, no, just create a situations of greater cooperations with the Iranian government that had started with the nuclear deal and facilitate and supported that protest movement in Iran to create the possibility of cooperations on the long run. I tend to think that the second version is a more amenable one. Those connections are important and that will delegitimize the current Iranian government, which was elected, I mean, as you know, the clerical world with a very low turnout in the past election. So it makes more sense, I would say, to continue any form of cooperation rather than just sort of pigeonhole the Iranian as the sort of the rogue state in the international order. A tough call for any, but nonetheless an important one for any astute American leader to undertake.
One on this side? Good.
It's hard to understand what Hamas was thinking on October 7th, and if they could look ahead and see where they are today. What are the leaders of Hamas? What's their end game? What are they? Is this what they wanted to achieve? And is it? Are they just puppets of Iran, and they really didn't have a choice?
Okay, they are puppets of Iran, for sure. They've been financed by Iran. They've been trained. The Hamas militia has been trained and funded by Iran, so we know that. What was their end game? Very difficult to know. They lost. They won the popular opinion in the world, by the way, but they lost in terms of what potential end game is. I'm not purview of any Israeli intelligence, American intelligence, so I don't know to what extent Hamas has been crippled in Gaza, but it has been really crippled and damaged. And so the question that one may ask, what is the next step for Hamas? They have lost Adam Haniyeh, was the political representative of Hamas. They have lost a couple of generals, military top leaders recently. And so Sinwar is in his tunnel, surrounded by a lot of hostages. You have to wonder, what is the next step for this individual? Maybe he wants an exit strategy. Maybe he wants Palestinians, prisoners, to come back to Gaza. Maybe he wants to retain, to some extent, some influence in the post-Gazan war, if that comes to be. I don't know. I wish I could enter the head of Sinwar, and I think I would just... But even, he's probably an individual who favored the chaos that had unfolded after October 7. He wished, probably, most likely, that there will be an escalation of regional war, because it wouldn't have been difficult for Hamas to surrender as just even a month after October 7. Just said, that's it. we're out, we're done, we no longer wish to be part of that deal. And then would have been stopped just there. The surrender would have ended. It didn't happen. So 40,000 people, Gazan, killed, and he's still not surrendering. So there is a much sort of providential perspective in his mindset, one may consider. And so perhaps, yes, that eternal war that would lead perhaps the resurrections of a caliphate. I have to think in those ways because that's not the Enlightenment way of thinking. But you got to think in those ways that perhaps this resurrections of an Islamic caliphate would come as a result of the fatigue of war, of the possibility of reunifications of the Islamic world in the regions. I believe that those are the terms that drive his political impulse.
I'm going to get this question in the center and then come to the back.
Thanks. Could you talk a little bit about the U.S., the call for the U.S. to stop arming, providing military assistance to Israel, and how does that impact what might happen, or does it?
The way the United States, especially the Biden administration's, Harris administration, whatever they said in political campaign, is that there's strong interest in making sure that Hamas is neutralized. They really do want that. I don't believe that they don't want that. I think that what they say in public speech and what's happening behind the corridor of power is very different. So I've even difficulty to believe that they didn't know what happened yesterday and today, and they did not agreed upon that course of actions by the Israeli government. But this is a speculation. I'm not sure whether the selling of weapons will change the courses of action. Perhaps I'm not sure. But there is another concern that the United States has, and it's not Hamas, it's Iran. And it's the proxy wars. So those weapons are not just funnel and channel in order to stop whatever group that is left in the Gaza Strip, but it's a way to make sure that Hezbollah is not getting stronger, is make sure that the Iraqi militias that are associated with Iran is not getting stronger, is to also make sure that the Houthis in Yemen don't gain traction. That is the reason why those weapons can keep getting delivered. And people often forget that this is not just an Israeli-Palestinian war. It is a broader war, and that is the one I believe that the United States has decided to engage in.
Our next question is back here.
Hi, thank you very much for this evening. Speculation as to what Hamas has accomplished. They have a world stage now. And when you look at what's happened within the United States on campuses, and other protests around the world. So the issue is out there. I ask, is there truly Palestinian leadership that can step in? Hamas is a terrorist organization, so it's not a leader of the people. The West Bank, the lack of leadership amongst the Palestinians there. Is there any place where Palestinians can find a true leader to represent them?
This is an important question. Thank you for asking it. I think we know as of now Mahmoud Abbas, who represents the PA, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, is a very corrupted individual. He does not have the support of his own populations. There has not been election for a long period of time. We know that even Sinwar does not have that level of support. And even before October 7, there were polls about what Gazans thought about Hamas, and only 33%, I believe, were supporting Hamas. So we have a void, a Palestinian void with respect to governance and Palestinian leadership, and that is a problem. That doesn't mean that there are no potential leaders. It means that we don't know them. And I think that we have a tendency to keep going through the old way by not just recognizing the potentiality of leaders who could emerge. I have attempted to do just that. When I was actually in Israel, I was making the very quest to many people who were part of the old establishment looking for the peace process back in Oslo, and I asked them, "You're all," sorry, I'm not should say that in that crowd, "you need younger leaders, much younger leaders." I just say, younger than me, younger than you, we need to find them. And when I said that, it was interesting that soon enough, they were putting me in communications with the Palestinian coalitions that was part of Oslo, and they said, yes, we know they are here, but we cannot recognize them because Israel cannot recognize leaders, since any form of normalizations will be perceived as detrimental for any Palestinian leader. So the question was, how do you create a space for instance, the American or Arab stakeholder in the Gulf countries to recognize those new leaders and even steward them and just identify those who are willing to coexist with an Israeli state that are enlightened. I have found bloggers who are writing extraordinary speeches, and I wonder why they have not been identified and recognized. So there is hope. They exist. They have to be recognized. They are in danger, by the way, those very enlightened people, because they know they are upsetting either Hamas or Fatah, and so they have to be protected. They have to be brought back to a space in which they can be discussed. So we hope, and we are going to have events like that when we bring those Palestinian leaders, hopefully to be recognized as the next generations of leaders who have been overlooked and created a possibility for the futures. I personally have done too many rounds of those peace issues, although I don't look that old, but still, and I would like to see this younger leadership coming forward and take the steward and seize the reign of command of a new peace process.
Other questions?
We have one here.
Thank you.
You used the phrase in passing earlier about freedom of and from religion. Is that possible in that region? Particularly the freedom from religion?
No. No, but, I always liked, I remember when I lived for 3 years in the United Arab Emirates in 2010, so lived for 3 years during the Arab Spring. And the one question that always surprised that people ask me, oh, you're teaching human rights. We don't need human rights. We have Islam. We have the Quran. This is good. We don't need it. This is a source of authority for us. We don't need any secular position. And then I reminded the people, students in Khalifa University and Sharjah University, where I was going, I said, truly, secularism is not about not being freed from religion. It's a way of finding a common denominators between the Sunni and the Shias and the Muslim and the Christian. It's a new space in which people can agree upon that another interpretation that doesn't have to be that part of Islam or this part of Islam or that part of Catholicism that can be reached. And in fact, I reminded that the separation of state and religions in the West was accomplished because there were conflict of religion. And as a result of that, people needed to find that secular space in order to agree upon. So they were convinced, and one of the gentlemen, I won't tell his name, but very high level at the political echelon of the United Arab, tell me, can you find me a Martin Luther? Because we really need one in this region. So who knows, you can convince people that sometimes it's to their interest to just find some form of separations between religion and state.
Other questions?
Right here. We have one here.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Are there any people in the United States that you think are coming forward to be really good spokespersons for the kind of ideas that you have?
On which side? Both, either side?
Of finding some sort of long-lasting peace, either the two-state solution or the one-state solution. I mean, is there anyone that you feel is a strong advocate for that from what you've seen?
Or one? Well, the two-state solution it's an old currency, the old parlance of American diplomacy. It's still coming back. The one-state solutions are usually young people on the fringe who bring it up, and they are not much heard in the region, but they are heard in academic setting. And the confederal approach pretty much I think I was David Christman were the first who wrote about that, but people might not know that, 20 years ago, in which we were looking for an effort to create better interim processes, to create a state that is both democratic and has the capacity to sustain itself and being viable, so it does not to become a bad neighbor. Because you might say that Israeli is the stronger partners in any confederal, but at the same time, democratic state, I heard it somewhere, just get along better when they can succeed in coexist together. There is less war likely to happen if they are too democratic. So the question is, how do we create those democracy on the Palestinian side? That is a big, big endeavor, not an easy one, but nonetheless possible. After all, you know, the United States has created, after 8 years of occupation in Germany, after World War II, not that it had created a state, the state was already there, but it created a governance, making sure that the governance will never actually veer to Nazism again. That was pretty much of a fantastic endeavor. So yes, there are external conditionality for economic development. You know, you can just say, you want funding, make sure that you don't violate some basic freedoms, including freedom from religion.
Thank you. Any last questions? Please join me in thanking Dr. Ishay on a wonderful presentation.